Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It's wonderful to see you. Last time, some of us gathered here for a Shabbat morning service. I spoke about how much I struggle with Jacob's actions in his early life. His wresting of his birthright away from his older twin Esau when Esau is famished. Jacob's deceit of his blind and aging father Isaac to get the firstborn son's blessing meant for Esau. And I think this week's story at last could soften us toward Jacob. In the passage right before the section Daniel read so beautifully for us, Jacob struggles with a faceless, nameless entity in the night and is renamed Yisrael, Israel. And then Jacob goes in the morning after that, at last, to reconcile with his brother Esau. As Daniel himself wrote recently, it's a very moving piece. The change of name of Jacob to Israel, Yisrael, always moved me, says Daniel, struggling with God. So Jacob returns after many years to his homeland in this week's Torah portion. He is married now with many children and wealthy and very different, one imagines, from that anxious and imperfect youth who fled his family and his brother Esau's wrath 20 years before. And the night before he is to reunite with his brother, he wrestles with this man. Then he meets his brother, and surprisingly, they are reconciled. What is going on here? Rashi believes that Jacob supposes that he fought with Esau's angel, or Esau himself, that night. This means that Jacob's nighttime wrestling experience is linked very closely with the events of the following day and his reconciliation with his brother. It makes sense that before night had fallen, Jacob very much believed, and with good reason, that when he would see Esau the next day, his brother would attack him. As far as Jacob and we know at that point, there was only bad blood between them. And Esau is coming, the Torah tells us, with 400 men, which seems like an overly large number to assemble just to greet your younger brother. Yet by the next day, immediately upon seeing one another, Esau forgives Jacob. Clearly something has changed, something to do with that man in the night. But although, as Rashi comments, Jacob may believe it was Esau's angel, we know that it was in fact God, or God's messenger. And indeed, when Jacob does finally see his brother Esau for the first time in years and years, Jacob says one of the most powerful to me lines in the whole Torah: "Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God." And Jacob falls weeping on his brother Esau's neck. Perhaps Jacob at last sees his brother's humanity, having himself wrestled with the divine. Or as my friend Rabbi Daniel Lichman writes, the Torah's repetition of this metaphor, the face of God, suggests that encounter with God we can understand to mean encounter with our own inner self. And perhaps it is this encounter with the self that enables Jacob to overcome fear, anger, and hatred, and to genuinely see God in his brother Esau. And this renaming, Yisrael, echoes Jacob's grandparents' renamings, Avram to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah, and symbolizes that Jacob, now Yisrael, truly is taking on his ancestors' covenant with God as his own. Not so different from when we are called to the Torah the first time by our Hebrew name at our bar or bat mitzvah, or when we convert and choose our own meaningful Hebrew name, or when we choose a different name as an adult. This Jewish teaching on the Parsha is repeated so often that it risks cliche, but like most cliche, is worth repeating. What does this teach us about the nature of the Jewish people's relationship with God, that the word Yisrael means to struggle or wrestle with the divine? Perhaps we suggest over and over, it means that we are not just to follow God's commandments unquestioningly, but that there is something inherent in being Yisrael that involves struggle. Or perhaps, as my Torah teacher, Rabbi Shimon Felix writes, Jacob's wrestling is a reminder to us never to assume that God is on our side, that we are surely in the moral right. That our spiritual ancestor wrestles with the cosmos in the night means that we too may be lost in the dark sometimes, unsure if we are making the right choices, and that we should embrace the humility of that and never be so sure of ourselves. And of course, this new Jacob, now Yisrael, the one who has struggled, is the one who finds reconciliation with his brother. One can well imagine how the Jacob of old, sly and superior, would be a character to inspire great anger in Esau, anger enough to amass an armed force. And one can equally imagine how the sight of this new brother, one who has seen God's face, and now in fact is limping from the hip where the man in the night pulled his joint bone, would be an altogether different sort of brother to meet in the daylight. It is only in struggling with God that Jacob can come to terms with what he did to his brother, and that Esau can forgive him. So wrestling with God, as we, the Jewish people, seem commanded to do, leads here to a reconciliation that would otherwise be impossible. And Jacob is limping. He has been made vulnerable and humble by this struggle. There is a lesson here too. Many, many years later, when Jacob at last is reunited with his own son, Joseph, in Egypt, after years in which Jacob, as an old man, grieved for Joseph and gave him up for dead, Jacob meets Joseph again in his old age and finds that he is alive. And Pharaoh, Joseph's boss, essentially, asks Joseph's father Jacob, "How old are you?" To which Jacob responds mysteriously, "Yemei shnei megorai shloshim, uma'at shana ma'at v'ra'im hayu yemei shnei chayai." And Jacob answered Pharaoh, "The years of my sojourn on earth are 130. Few and hard have been the years of my life." Few and hard have been the years of my life, says Jacob. Jacob began a callow child when we met him a couple of weeks ago, stealing his brother's inheritance. Now he wrestles with himself, with an oppositional force, perhaps with his brother, and at last reconciles with himself. Perhaps this too is what the struggle implied in the name Yisrael is about. Few and hard have been the years of my life, says Jacob years later. But he has changed and learned a great deal, which is perhaps all we too can hope for ourselves. Shabbat Shalom.